there's been a lot of action here today, right? The speech of the UN was one thing. The president weighed in on all sorts of different things. He complained about the escalators, but also talked about the conflicts we've been covering overseas. And then it's the meetings on the sidelines. You always watch in these situations, especially the one with President Zelenskyy of Ukraine. President Trump telling NATO countries, yeah, maybe they should shoot down those Russian jets if they're violating airspace. And we have new reporting from that airspace this hour, one of the nations where we've seen that kind of thing happen. Of course, NewsNation's Robert Sherman has been live the last few days in Estonia, all right? Robert joins us from there once again tonight. And so there's that, Robert, and also the president this afternoon and saying, and what, by the way, it's quite a shift for him when you consider what he said in the past. He thinks Ukraine can win the war, right? Well, what's the latest?
Yeah, I mean, a lot to talk about here, Connell, especially when it comes to the foreign affairs here in Europe. A lot of tough talk has been flying around over the last couple of hours, starting with that situation in Ukraine. I mean, this is something that the eyes of the world have been on as Russia has continued to fire away at Ukraine. But you had President Zelenskyy in New York, who is talking about a big week of diplomacy here to have with the UN General Assembly. And today, the president, as you pointed out, changing his tune a bit, saying he believes that Ukraine has the ability to win this war and reestablish the pre-war borders from before the invasion carried out by Russia in the early months of 2022. It's quite the stark contrast that we've heard coming from the White House. Now, there's some caveats to all of this. He believes that a lot of this is going to come down to Europe weaning itself off of Russian oil, a criticism that he has been levying more and more in recent weeks here. But he says at this juncture here, he believes that Russia is hurting and they are prepared to continue sending weapons to NATO to use as they see fit. And that plays into the other element of tension that you have in the region. In recent days, you've seen all these airspace incursions, the big one being these 3 Russian jets that violated Estonia's airspace. There were emergency meetings being held by NATO today in which they said they would defend every inch of their territory. Poland going so far as to say that if any aircraft, drones, jets enter their airspace, they are fully prepared to shoot them down. The president was asked about that today, and you heard the soundbite earlier in which he said green light on that he thinks that NATO should have the ability to do that. But looking at the other side of all of this, we've also heard from Russia here this evening. They've been talking about the START treaty and continuing on their relations there, but also read what Dmitry Medvedev had to say. He's the former president of Russia, known for his unabashed comments, and he said today, quote, "The U.S. must give up on weakening Russia with sanctions and tariffs. Otherwise, the risk of direct conflict remains high." Tough talk coming from Russia here this evening as the president seems to be changing a bit of his sentiments when it comes to the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, he does. I mean, that's what we'll see if the sentiments turn into different actions. We'll talk to Ambassador Bill Taylor in a minute about that. But it is a change. It's interesting, right, Robert? Now, while you're there, speaking of these airspace incursions in Estonia, in that area, I know you got this inside look. It's again, good NewsNation exclusive reporting about how NATO's kind of dealing with all of this, right? As we take a look at some of your reporting here. Tell us what you found out.
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen over the last couple of days here, Connell, these recent events have shown just how highly strategic the Baltic is. But it's not just the airspace above, it's also the Baltic Sea. It's one of the few parts of the world in which NATO military ships and Russian naval ships cross paths on a rather consistent basis. It's highly strategic. But as we have all these conversations about Russian oil, this is also where Russia's so-called shadow fleet operates. Hundreds of ships that usually traverse the Baltic Sea. They have opaque ownership paper trails, and they're flagged under different countries like Liberia and the Marshall Islands. But this is what Russia uses to move oil and gas and try to evade sanctions from the U.S. and from the EU. We're going to give an up-close look on all of this here. That's coming up on Elizabeth Vargas Reports tonight.
All right, that's good stuff. We'll be watching that.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.